Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 21 of Zion's Finest. This is Kenny Brown, and I'm joined by my brother, Samuel Sweeten. We're going to be doing something fun today. What we're going to do is we are going to be talking about how to beat everyone's favorite list, which is Vader Grievous. As we are waiting for more units to drop, I have not gotten any new plays with the new map pack that just released. We'll be doing stuff on that eventually. But right now, while we're kind of waiting for new content, what we thought we would do is, as people are playing in more premier events and as people are figuring out and playing more Vader Grievous, we'd like to offer our thoughts in terms of how we think it is best to approach beating the list. So we've played with it and against it a bunch. And Sam and I have taken somewhat different tacks not different tacks, but just we've played different things against, people running these kind of lists. So we've got different ideas as to what we think works, although a lot of it is largely going to overlap. Before we get into that, I just want to say, so the only event that we've got on the horizon in Utah is Justin Chavez is running that premier event at Demolition Games next Saturday, November 11th. I'm not positive on the start time, so just check. It is pinned in the Utah events channel in the Slack, so go check it out there. One other thing is I have not done this, and I am sorry, is that what I want to do is when we are posting our polls and questions like that on episodes, if there's good feedback, I'd like to let you know what's going on with that. So one of the things that I noticed was when we did our episode 19 was talking about premier list building. We asked people what their preferred list building strategy was. Is it 4 flex squads, core and complements, or 2 distinct squads? And pretty much everybody, not everybody, but 63% of the people who responded said that their preferred approach was 2 distinct squads, which is very interesting because that would not have been my response. My response is a core plus complements. And I thought it was really interesting that people would prefer to run 2 totally separate lists as opposed to building around a central synergy. I assume that's related to the fact that right now there might just not be enough. If you're either running separatists as I think that is kind of your core, your core group around Dooku, or maybe you're running Republic, and then there's just not a ton else, right? In terms of, you can build 4 lists that are all doing the same thing, just in kind of a different way. So maybe that's why, but anyway, I just thought that was interesting. So with that being the case, let's just jump right into this. Sam, take it away.
So we're talking about how to beat Vader. And the first thing to think about is, what is the Vader list trying to do? And they're trying to make melee attacks that wound your characters to get that extra momentum and to accelerate their scoring. So the very first thing I thought of with how to counter these lists is I need characters that punish melee attacks and that punish wounding other characters. And we've seen plenty of those in this game. It's something the designers seem to like to do.
Do you want to just give us the quick rundown of what you think is probably the best version of the Vader Grievous list right now?
Yeah, so the Vader Grievous list includes, you have Vader with a 4-point secondary. You're looking at Jango or Obi-2, and then you're taking Magna Guards, and then you have Grievous, and then either your Jango or your Obi-2, whichever one you didn't bring, and Fifth Brother.
Yep.
That's what I think of as the best, but there's plenty of variants that this all can also apply to. This can be Vader Maul, Vader X, kind of Vader aggro is the archetype that's really here.
What you're looking to do is leverage Vader's incredibly strong identity, which is allowing your characters that make melee attacks to take 2 damage to roll 3 extra dice. So if you've got access to heals on your combat tree, it can be almost free. And that's kind of how it is with a figure like Obi-2. But even if you don't, even if you're just looking to leverage damage, you're taking 2 damage to deal more than 2 damage most of the time. So you're just trading up. And it is a trade that you get to choose when you make. So it makes so that when I have played Vader Grievous, and when I've played against Vader Grievous, not running a hyper defensive list, I find it is almost always the case that I am wounding a figure nearly every activation, maybe every other activation. I mean, anytime I want to, I am able to wound figures just because your damage output just goes through the roof. And that's why we're also, when Sam's talking about these figures that you take, one reason that Grievous, Maul, Jango, Magnas are good pairs is because they are able to consistently, with all that extra dice, climb up their tree in order to really secure what you need in terms of displacement, damage, just anything like that. So
yeah, Vader just makes all of your triggers more consistent, right? You can do a lot more when Vader's in your list.
Yep.
And we've talked about that a lot in the global power of it all.
Yeah.
But pretty early on, I was playing against Vader Grievous at my local shop when I was back in Utah, Curtis playing it. And I decided, you know what? I'm going to try some primaries that I think are good against Vader Grievous. And I came up with the idea of Dooku Ahsoka.
Yeah.
This was right after the Grievous release. And that's kind of is what got, at least for me, the ball rolling on how to think about tackling these lists.
Yeah.
How to build these defensive lists.
Yeah, I can remember when you actually talked about Ahsoka Dooku. So I ran Ahsoka Maul and Mandos when the game was released. But after it was kind of clear that the Separatists were higher on the power level, I shelved them and, was playing. I was playing a lot of Republic at that time, trying to figure that out, and playing Separatists, and had shelved Ahsoka, even though she's my favorite. And then when you brought up this list of Dooku Ahsoka, that was when I got very interested in that archetype, because it is the first iteration we have seen, so not discussing Mama T, has not been released yet, of a list where what you're doing is you're running Ahsoka, Obi-2. You're actually running, in a lot of ways, kind of a very similar kind of list, because you're running a similar power level of units. But instead of running lists that are focusing on aggro, you're running lists that are focusing much more on the defense and the inversion, blunting of your opponent's power curve. So you're running Ahsoka, Obi-2, Clan Kryze, or somebody in that third spot. Then you are running Dooku Jango Magnas. So Dooku Jango Magnas is probably the best single squad right now in the game. It's in terms of what it is able to bring. So that is your core, and then what you're bringing with Ahsoka, Obi-2, and Clan Kryze is incredibly strong control. And so I don't know, Sam, when you were originally workshopping the Ahsoka Dooku, was that the list that you had come to, or was that just what we came to after more time, more discussion?
So originally I didn't have Obi-2 in there because I didn't own Obi-2 at that time.
Oh, okay.
So I was playing around with some Kraken B2s under Ahsoka. But eventually it ended up in the Obi-2 direction. But the idea of the list was still there. The idea is that if the Vader Grievous player wounds one of my characters, it's incredibly punishing for them.
Yeah.
Because I get force back, and then I get movement and or attacks.
Yeah, and we are going to talk about piloting later, but I will just say that I have found Dooku especially, just because he's such a strong unit, and he is actually so strong into a list like Vader Grievous because he is an excellent frontliner. He is almost impossible to remove off of points against a melee attack. He's just so defensive and so punishing. And so I have found that list really, it's not that it's a hard counter, but it definitely has the resources it needs in order to tackle them. And one new primary that has been released that everyone is super sweet on is Mama T. Mama T is kind of an interesting figure because she's like Ahsoka in that when your figures are wounded, she is able to make a movement and attack action, but she is better than Ahsoka, at least on this sense, in that she is able to dash anywhere. She doesn't have to dash or advance towards the figure. And then she makes a 5 dice ranged attack. And she has when she is on, I think it's her Great Mother side, where she's on blast with her ranged attack. Her ranged attack expertise is extremely solid. But Mama T, what is her problem is that unlike Ahsoka and Dooku, I have found that she is a very fragile unit. Not that she's not very fragile, but she is not able to withstand the blows that Ahsoka and Dooku can take. I mean, Ahsoka cannot be one-shot, and Dooku is very difficult to bring down, whereas Mama T, if she comes up, your opponent can converge, wound her pretty easily, and then she's still incredible, but she is not... It definitely brings her down on the power curve, right?
Yeah, that's the interesting trade-off you're getting. You're getting more range on your counter attacks and more control.
Yes.
But you're sacrificing some of that defensive strength that you were bringing the list for in the first place.
Yeah.
So I think Mama T is still a viable primary to bring into Vader Grievous, but she's not as specifically tech to them as Dooku Ahsoka is.
That is a great point. Probably a better, more flexible primary, but not into this specific matchup, right? Because Dooku, Grievous, Vader, your Magna Guards, if they're able to 1-2 her, they can bring her down, right? And that's a little scary. They also have pretty strong reach. So if she comes up and, she's doing her thing, if they're able to collapse onto her, she's going to go down. So, and if you're running, I assume the idea is you're running Mama T and you're probably running Dooku with her. And then, well, if you're trying to counter Vader Grievous, and it's just you don't quite have as much defensive tech as Sam has just said. One other thing that we've talked about and that I've referenced is that OB2 is probably the single best figure against Vader Grievous because all of their attacks are melee, and it is very easy to position OB2 into a way that your opponent is often not able to, they might not have two targets. How the mind trick works, in addition to how it interacts with the melee attacks that your opponent's going to be making, it can just be absolutely devastating.
Yeah, mind trick is one of the most back-breaking abilities in the game. Yep. I had a game against Vader in my league game this week, just recently, where that exact thing happened. I had set up my Magna Guard, so they were just in range 3 of OB2. His Vader came up to attack them, and I mind trick it, and you're engaged with Magna Guards.
Yeah.
You're not hitting anyone else. So
it was brutal.
Yeah, it was real brutal, but just against Vader in general, even if it's not the Magna Guard interaction, still rolling 2 less dice. And then maybe they have to swing in, Vader has to swing into your Ahsoka, if they even want to, because there's reasons why Vader might say, nope, you know what, I'm just not going to attack into Ahsoka. So it's really, really powerful into the Vader lists.
OB2, though, is, as a secondary, is excellent into Vader. You know who's also, because he's good into everybody, is Jango. And the reason why is that Jango has the ability to pull and pin people, and pinning melee units generally is really, really strong, right? And he also, what's going to be happening with these Vader lists, what I have found, is that they are taking lots of damage in order to do lots of damage. And if you are able to blunt some of the defense or some of the offense with your heavily defensive units, they are still taking damage. Jango then all of a sudden becomes he is much better at wounding enemy figures with not so fast before they go, because all Vader is doing is just increasing the damage everywhere, and including on his own units, and that can lead to some really opportunistic plays with Jango with not so fast, where you can put some damage on Vader. He's taken some damage. Normally he's got 12 health, but if you're able to chip him down a little bit, Jango can really take advantage of bringing those health thresholds down.
Speaking of blunting the damage, you talked about Jango blunting some of it with that pin and being able to take advantage of the damage that Vader's putting on his people.
Yep.
I want to talk a little bit about disarm against that particular list, because the Vader Grievous list is focused so heavily on attacking and has excellent expertise trees that disarm can be a powerful counter to them.
Yep.
However, disarm seems the best place to get disarm is from handmaids, which aren't that tanky of a unit. They're fine, but they're not defensive powerhouses. Yeah. And I've tested some disarm heavy lists into the Vader lists, and they felt okay, playable. I don't feel awful, but I haven't found them to blunt as much as I had hoped. Have you played around with any disarm-focused lists against Vader?
So I have not played around with disarm focus lists. I heavily value disarm against Vader Grievous, especially Magna Guards. I think one of my problems with focusing on it in terms of a viable counter strategy is that I think of disarm most of the time as translating. Most of the time your opponent is going to roll 1 to 3 expertise, right? Which is, which can translate into it with these incredible trees that they've got. Most of the time that's taking away 1 to 2 crits. So 1 to 2 steps on their tree, which is awesome. That's obviously really strong. But that is most of the time translating into 2 to 3 damage is what they're losing with not having access to those extra trees. And so that can be that can stop them from wounding a unit, absolutely. But sometimes it's the case that, like with Vader, he is rolling, and Grievous, they're rolling so many dice that unless they're attacking a primary or a defensive secondary, that losing the expertise is not sufficient to outweigh the extra dice they're getting from Vader anyway. So not always, obviously it does. It can have a big impact, but it's just something to think about, to think, what are you actually taking away from your opponent if you focus on this disarm? I think it's very good, but just something to be aware of.
No, I agree with that. I found disarm to be powerful, and it's less situational than something like strain, but it is still situational. That Grievous with 11 dice can still munch through any of your clone troopers, even if he's disarmed. Likely. Yeah. Not guaranteed, but likely.
I mean, I think into your clone troopers, he's only needing, three steps? And so with 11 dice, it is very unlikely that Grievous doesn't get his 3 steps against your clones. So, I mean, I do think it matters a lot if you have got the ability to put a disarm on figures that are going to be attacking into Mama T. That can be a really big deal. But so you should think about, if you're applying disarm, you got to think, what are the pieces I am really trying to protect here? And also you should be thinking, so the thing that is not good about disarming Magna Guards is that it only applies to one of their attacks. The thing that is great about disarming Magna Guards is every expertise is effectively taking away a crit. And if they are not able to climb their tree, if they're being reduced to 2 or 3 steps, I mean, they're still getting 6 damage, which is stupid. They're getting 5 damage. But, they're not able to be getting their heals and additional shoves, right? They have a heal on their top on their 4th step, and I think it's 2 damage and another shove as the last step on their bottom tree. So just something to think about. If you're going to be leveraging this conditions game, you should be really thinking hard about who are your targets for applying that to, and how are you going to leverage that to protect your units.
Yeah, I think those are excellent points. I do also think that these counter lists are not necessarily straightforward to pilot.
No.
At least that's been my experience with them.
Absolutely not.
They're pretty thinky lists. What have you found as you've been piloting?
So here's my thing. So Ahsoka Dooku, and I have said this from the beginning, when I decided that this was going to be, I was going to adopt Sam's baby and take this list. Let me set the stage for you wonderful listeners. So Sam, we're all talking about Vader Grievous. And when it first bursts onto the scene, what happens is, I think Will has been playing what he calls more machine than man. And it is, it really is just Vader Grievous. So he's been playing this list. And it's not that he was the only one playing it. Other people were playing it. But it was our first encounter with this list. And it just hit like a sledgehammer. Because we're all playing, I'm playing against Sam Separatists, which are extremely mobile. And Sam's super good. But the damage output was just unlike anything we had ever seen. And we're all running the Republic. Well, me and Matt are running the Republic and just getting smacked. And we don't know what's going on. So we're trying to figure out, how do we beat this list? What are we going to do? I guess we can run Seps. And I hadn't really had a ton of exposure to Seps at that point. Sam had been running them mostly. But then as we're talking about this, Sam brings up, hey, there's this list. There's this Ahsoka Dooku idea, right? And he, gives the initial idea as to what this list is going to try and do. And I instantly know, I'm like, that is it. That is what I want to run. So I have been running Ahsoka Dooku for a few months now. And I ran it primarily as a counter to Vader Grievous. And I've already laid out the list, but let me just explain to you what Vader Grievous is trying to do most of the time is they're trying to advance onto the midline, kind of like Seps, but instead of winning the tempo game in terms of getting ahead on points, taking a lot of points and forcing you to get off, they are moving onto the center line in order to project further forward so that they can wound any figures that you bring onto the midline. If you send anybody up, they are going to kill them. So, that's their game plan. If you send clone troopers up to contest the midline against Vader Grievous, you are playing directly into their hands. You should not be doing that. And so that's kind of a hard thing about playing the Republic, because it's like, well, what am I supposed to do? Well, the one thing you should not do is you should not send your clones up. Okay. So what Ahsoka Dooku does is it will send up Ahsoka or it will send up Dooku. And what those figures do is they present a kind of counter problem to your opponent in terms of being able to address them. Ahsoka is not super offensive, but she is extremely defensive, and her ability to move around the board makes it so that if you have a point, if they're going to come up and wound your figure that's holding that point, Ahsoka can jump over in order to make it so you don't lose it, right? And make an attack or get heals off. So on both ways, now you're able to contest the center line. And then what you also have is OB2. So you've got OB2, Ahsoka, and Dooku are kind of anchoring, not kind of, they are anchoring your midline. So, and what you're doing is you're absorbing your opponent's attacks. And my general strategy is to spread them out. I kind of want OB2 to either be, I know this means absolutely nothing with how I'm going to say this, but either totally by himself or right in the middle. And the idea there is that he is off on his own so that he cannot be attacked with Mind Trick, or he is in the middle of all of your units so that everybody has to be, every time your opponent is going to attack, he's going to have to think, what do I do about Mind Trick, right? So, but you've got Ahsoka, Obi, and Dooku as your front line. And then what you're doing is with Clan Kryze, with Jango, and then with Magna Guards, they are acting as a kind of cleanup. Clan Kryze especially is super awesome for being just kind of a responsive force. Oh, I got to swing that point. I'm going to jump my Clan Kryze over there, and they're going to knock this guy off. So that's my general idea, is that if you're running a list like a counter list like Ahsoka Dooku, is that Ahsoka, Dooku, Obi-2, you're pushing them forward in order to run into the line, which sounds a little crazy because you'd think that's what your opponent wants you to do. But really, you have got the defensive tools in order to answer them. That's my idea.
Yeah, that's how I've been running them too. I haven't, even though I started this list perhaps earlier than you, I haven't played it as much as you. I still pull it out and play it because I genuinely enjoy playing this list. It's a lot of fun to run.
Yeah.
However, even with this basic idea of putting your defensive midliners, your Dooku, Ahsoka, Obi-2s centrish to help blunt the blows, there is a fair amount of knowing when to reserve cards and when your force is worth more unspent than using it for abilities. Yeah. Because the force economy can kind of play a mind trick of its own in this list, where the threat of Ahsoka counterattacking or the threat of Mind Trick can do more than actually spending force to jump with Jango.
Yeah,
so
such a great point.
You have to balance how you're spending your resources. And I've found that to be one of the trickiest parts of using this list, because if you're caught with your pants down on your force economy, then all of a sudden you're open to be punished and Ahsoka's melting, or Obi-2 just dies, and you're like, now my force economy is really awful for the rest of the game. Yep. You have to be even more restrictive on when you reserve characters. So there's a certain amount of knowing when not to use force that is important in piloting this list.
Yeah, I also think one thing about that is that with a list like Ahsoka Dooku, and maybe we can talk about Mama T and how that is different here in a second, is that with Ahsoka and Dooku is awesome because Dooku does so much for your economy, for your force economy, because he doesn't spend any and he's just giving it back, right? And his Magna Guards take no force. And Jango will take 2 force most of the time, I think, every round, but he has a high likelihood of being able to bring that force back, right? So most of the time, Dooku's squad is at most a net -2 in terms of your running through your deck. Whereas Ahsoka, she needs 1 for force speed, which I think is generally, most of the time you're going to be thinking pretty hard about using force speed just because it helps Ahsoka get in the fray. What's the Matter Too Fast for You costs 2 force, and then obviously Mind Trick costs 2 force, and Clan Kryze needs that 1 force most of the time in order to do their jetpack jump. And I'm using Clan Kryze as my example. That Clan Kryze could be a lot of different things. I have run B2s there. I have run, it could be a lot of things. I'm just using them because I love them and I think they fit really well into this archetype. But the point is that Ahsoka's squad is using, most of the time, you want to have 4 to 5 force budgeted for them every round. And like Sam said, if you have spent through your force in terms of reserving units or using your abilities in a way where you're not getting maximum value, if you have one force left, now all of a sudden your opponent can effectively disregard most of your defensive tech and just lay into you. So I will always, unless it is an absolute emergency, I will want to have at least 2 force safe. Because that 2 force, it's like Sam said, it's the threat of what's the matter too fast for you, and in which case your opponent is most of the time just not going to attack into Ahsoka or Mind Trick. So that's just something to think about as you're playing a list like Ahsoka Dooku, is to be very careful and budging your resources. One good thing about the deck is that I think the only really bad first activations, I will say too, are your supports. You really don't want Magna Guards to go first before Dooku's had a chance to move them up. And Clan Kryze, you really want to be a response piece to what your opponent brings up onto the midline. Ahsoka's an amazing turn 1 activation. I mean, I know it feels bad to not have your primaries go up and smack people, but Ahsoka's not doing that much damage anyway. And you should not plan for her to do a lot of damage. What you should plan for her to do is anchor points and protect your people. OB2 is probably your best round 1 activation because he can go take a point and he effectively cannot be removed except at heavy cost from your opponent. So if you're thinking about whether or not to reserve, unless you pull a support, I mean, this sounds crazy, but if you pull your Shatter Point, just move OB2, right? Or move Ahsoka up there. Or Dooku, actually. Dooku.
Move Dooku. Yeah, that's what I would do with my Shatter Point. Get a bunch of Magna Guards up there, get Dooku in a defensive position.
Yeah, Dooku's always the best person in Shatter Point. I was more saying that you can, your order activation outside of your supports, all you're thinking about doing is putting resources onto the midline so that you can start taxing your opponent, right? So those are kind of the metrics that you should be thinking about. Remember, Ahsoka is not going to do very much damage. OB2 is not going to do very much damage. Your Magna Guards are going to do consistent damage, but not very much because you're not running Vader. I mean, they're going to do 3 damage in a push, like they're awesome. Clan Kryze is going to be doing 4 to 5 damage, push pin or push, right? So Dooku is probably one of your top damage dealers. And then Jango with his not so fast. This sounds crazy. No, it doesn't, because Jango's super good. But Jango's not so fast is one of your main damage outputs, even not to wound figures, just to put damage on the board, right?
So, it really is in that list. It's a relatively low damage list, partly because of Ahsoka, OB2 are just not incredibly high damage figures, unless you're getting off those, unless you're rolling well on those 5 dice attacks from Ahsoka and they're triggering.
Yeah.
So you have to spend force on not so fast. I also think that sometimes the other thing about force economy is to know when to spend it to try and bait your opponents into attacking. Because sometimes it's better for you to have a figure wounded so you can trigger abilities than it is to keep them alive.
Yeah.
And sometimes it can be hard to resist. Oh, they're down on force. Now I can smack that OB2. But if they wound OB2, now you get force back and you get to reposition your board.
Yeah. Mind Trick costs 3, which is a bummer. But also he's rolling more dice, right, at that point.
Yep.
OB2 is, I love it. Oh, I love it when my opponent puts a lot of resources into wounding OB2. Because all it does is make him more consistent. And yes, it sucks to have Mind Trick cost 3, but really what Obi is doing, what he's meant to be doing is unless he's off by himself, is he's pulling attacks off of your other figures that you don't want to get wounded, right? Or it's shifting damage away from where your opponent can gain a wound, so that it's effectively requiring your opponent to spread out damage in a way that he might not want to, right? So it is not a bad thing if OB2 is going to get wounded. But what you just said brings up something that I've thought about, and this is specifically in reference to Mama T. So I messaged Diz and asked him to give me some wisdom about Mama T, because I've run her a few times, 6 times. I mean, I love Mama T, and I think she's such a cool figure. I love her character in Clone Wars. I think she's just got a really interesting story, and I think her design in Shatterpoint is pitch perfect in terms of what she's trying to do. So I want to get better with her, and Diz runs her a lot. So I said, Diz, what's going on with Mama T? And we were talking about how she works, and he said, I want Night Sisters and Savage. I don't think he runs Savage most of the time, but I want my Night Sisters to get wounded. He says, I'm moving them up with the intention of that. I want my opponent to wound them so that I can get more triggers of Mama T, because her out of activation attack is way better than what Ahsoka is doing. Not as good as what Dooku is doing, but way better than Ahsoka, right? And so Ahsoka is trying to protect your units, whereas Mama T's like, no, kill him. Let me get free attacks, right?
I would argue that Dooku's is a more powerful effect, but the triggering on supports makes Mama T's really spicy. That's what makes hers really good.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because the thing is Scott, who has played Vader Grievous a lot, and what he does playing into Ahsoka Dooku or these control focus lists is he doesn't attack primaries and secondaries. He just goes for supports, right? And so now Dooku's ability never triggers. And that's in my opinion, if you're Ahsoka Dooku, that's kind of a win. It's forcing your opponent to not do their ideal game plan. So you keep Clan Kryze and your Magnas away, and make them earn it. But at the very least, with Mama T, it's like, okay, wound my supports. Here I come. I'm coming to blast you, right? So
and conversely, I still run B2s in my Ahsoka Dooku list to kind of replicate the Mama T effect by having B2s having that range snipe when people get wounded.
Yep.
And I keep them back instead of the Magnums because I know they're going after my supports. Yep. Like the Clan Kryze are going to keep them back.
Yep.
And so just B2s can kind of do a similar thing. But Mama T's 5 dice attack and wanting people to get wounded is such a good counter to the list.
Yep.
And she does a lot of good chip damage on her 5 dice attacks.
Oh, yeah.
So we've talked a lot about the primaries that are on paper just good counters to Vader Grievous.
Yep.
But we know that these type of lists aren't for everyone. The people enjoy playing their Separatists and their Republic that don't have these counter units. What have you found when playing Republic that are the best strategies to fight against Vader Grievous, even if you don't have the best matchup?
So here's the thing. So I have played Republic into Vader Grievous just a few times. I haven't played it as much as Matt. So my take here is heavily informed by those plays and just what I've observed with Matt. And I think the biggest thing is that you cannot move your clones to the midline. They cannot be. If you move them to the midline, they are going to be wounded almost immediately, right? They are just grist for the mill. So what you're wanting to do is, let's say you're running Obi Mace. Obi and Mace are extremely defensive units. Mace in particular. Mace is so good into Vader Grievous because he is always engaged whenever it matters, because they have to engage him in order to do damage to him. He is, I think, maybe besides Dooku, the worst figure to attack in the game, because even if you can wound him, because you will get so little value out of him, right? And so Dooku's probably worse, because if you wound Dooku, then he's going to be able to do things. But if you wound Mace, he's not going to be able to do things. But it costs your opponent, or it costs the Mace player nothing. So Mace, put him forward. Let his body, he's got over 30 health, right? Like, that is what you want. Make your opponent go into him, do damage, he can put a ton of damage out. He can wound Grievous. He can one-shot Grievous. Absolutely. I mean, he needs to roll pretty well, or be in Vapod form, right? But you're putting him up. Put Obi-2 up. You want those Jedi primaries to be your front lines. Rex is okay, right? Like going forward, but just at all costs. I know it sounds crazy because you're not going to score points, but it is way better to not be taking and flipping midline points. It is better to do that and not have your figures being wounded than moving up, having your figures be wounded, and then they're flipping the points anyway. That's the biggest thing I've learned, is you think, I'm getting down on tempo. My opponent is taking the midline points. Maybe, but at least your opponent's not wounding your figures, right? So let your opponent be the first one to approach onto the midline. Then you can use your clone attacks to your range attacks in order to start chipping them down, swing a point, swing 2 points, right? It's a bummer to be the person who has to claw for everything back. But that kind of has to be your gameplay. You cannot win the scrum. You will not win the scrum. And so if you try, you are just going to be a very sad panda bear. So keep your figures back. Be super disciplined about when you commit up. And that's probably my number one thing if you're running clones into a list like Vader Grievous.
I've not played a lot of clones into Vader Grievous. I've played some Anakin lists that sometimes take clones, sometimes don't.
Okay.
But I think the general idea, because I've played a fair amount of just straight Separatists, Dooku Grievous, and as I said, the Anakin Dookus, even some Padme Anakins, is your primaries need to be your juicy targets.
Yep, exactly.
That's just the general play. These are the hardest characters to wound. They're going to have a harder time completely removing them from the board, because Vader Grievous can consistently remove your supports from the game if the game goes that long. Yeah, They can just wipe them off. But you can do the same to them. Their supports become quite fragile when they're taking 2 damage when they attack. Fifth Brother, his durability drops significantly when he's only playing with 7 stamina. I mean, with 7 health. So you end up with these units that can go down a lot quicker, that you can remove them from the game too. So you can, if you have the right type of list, you can match back in your blow for blow.
Yeah.
Which is what I often try and do if I'm playing a Grievous list against them. Even if it's not the Vader version, it's like, okay, I can still spread out more because mobility is in my favor because I'm playing Grievous and droids. And I can hunt down his secondaries and his supports and just I'm gonna take some big hits, but I can match fairly well against that same damage. So it's an interesting, you need to decide what will be your sacrificial pieces and what are going to be your targets.
Sam, tell me about playing Separatists into Vader Grievous. Have you done that very much?
I have. So Dooku Grievous is probably my most played list. I play a lot of different things, but that one's probably the one I've played the most.
Yeah.
And from my experience into it is you still, ideally, if you want Dooku to be your first activation or very near the beginning, and have him go up there and sit up there and just be a pain to deal with, they have to commit a Django activation or something to get him out of position. And so Dooku's just always a thorn in their side, but you can trade relatively effectively into them. If you put Grievous up as a juicy target, which he is, they want to take out Grievous.
He's super juicy.
Yeah, then you're triggering your Dooku abilities. Yeah. And if you can get consistent chip damage, especially from B2s who give very good chip damage for 5 dice attacks, and they can do it from a long range because of their massive range. Whereas Magna Guards are also great targets, but they're not always set up to do the attack.
Yep.
You can match them damage for damage. As long as you're keeping your supports back and present your secondaries and primaries as targets, you can do a pretty decent job. Kraken's definitely one-shottable, but it's hard. 10 health with protection and steadfast is they have to get the good roll.
Yep.
Not the crazy roll, just good.
Yeah.
But we know Django is relatively defensible, but it can be a bit of a chore to chew through some of those people. Yeah, but they can definitely do it.
Yeah, so is the idea there that you're kind of running a half game where half of your game is matching them for damage. They're taking damage, you're dealing damage back. And the other half is you are running the Dooku game where you have this very strong defensive piece, and if they're going to wound your Grievous, your Kraken, your Django, you're going to be able to heavily punish them. And your B2s are on the back line. Magnas are with Dooku, so that attacking into them can be a little risky with these melee attacks. So you're effectively doing a similar thing. Do you split your forces up? Or so if I'm running Ahsoka Dooku, I am effectively trying to contest all 3 points by, splitting my primaries up, and OB2 is going to one of the others, right? What are you doing with droids?
I am typically committing to 2. Okay. That these are going to be mine, and you have to come take them from me, and you must take out my primaries and secondaries to do so, and I will punish you with Dooku's ability if you do that.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's really interesting because Grievous is such a juicy target because he is able to do so much on his activation. That's what's so interesting about him. He's like Dooku in that he's able to do so much, and he's also so vulnerable. So when he goes up, if you're playing against Grievous most of the time, if you're playing against Grievous most of the time, you're going to see him. He's going to come up on the midline. You're like, well, that's the person I'm going to go kill, right? Because he's not very defensive. But now with Dooku and with how you're playing with all of these droids, it's like, awesome. Now I want, you can wound Grievous, right? He is unlikely to be removed from the game. All you're doing is making my scuttle cost one more. And now I'm able to get all these other triggers to put more damage out. So I'm able to match you in the damage race, right?
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Depending on the game, you're going to want to, contest more of the midline points. And we'll see how Sinister Sabotage changes things up with how you want to contest.
Great
but
point.
Generally, I think you do want to be fighting over the midline. You just want to put the right units there.
Yep.
I do think that it's important as the Vader Grievous player to know how to counter these defensive lists.
Agreed.
And part of this came from part of seeing how to punish this came from my TTS game I just played in the league this last week. I played against Vader Grand Inquisitor against Dooku Ahsoka. And the critical error he made that lost him the game essentially was in Struggle 1, he managed to wound my Dooku. And he could have stopped and left my Dooku at 9 health with pinned and strained sitting on the center point.
Yep.
But instead he wounded me. And wounding me got Magna Guards into they were able to climb up a ladder, and I got forced back to trigger more OB2. And it got Ahsoka to deal... Ahsoka was able to move to the attacker, and I rolled hot and dealt like 6 damage to his bounty hunters that it did the wounding people.
Ooh, that's spicy.
Yeah, and because of that alone, because I was able to reposition and get damage out, it just turned the tables so that Struggle 1 was so heavily in my favor because I got to do essentially an activation during his activation. Whereas if he had just stopped, left Dooku alive, it's okay. He could just put more bodies on there to try and outswarm me, and it wouldn't have gotten this big swing of being able to get this massive control and board positioning advantage based on when he wounded me. So sometimes as a Vader Grievous player, be aware that you really don't want to trigger these Mama T abilities, these Ahsoka abilities, these Dooku abilities, and sometimes it's better to just leave them on 1 or 2 health with pinned and strained, and you're still alive, but your next activation is going to be really bad.
Yeah, it's also the case that you should be thinking in tandem with this. You're already winning the damage trade, right? And so the idea should be, if you're running against Ahsoka Dooku, you should very, very rarely be attacking Ahsoka or Dooku. I think almost never. And if you're going to attack into the primaries or into the secondaries, you should be thinking, do I need to wound them? If I do, what is the worst thing my opponent can do if I wound them? What am I going to do with Ahsoka being able to move and get an attack or 3 heal? What am I going to do with Dooku refreshing 2 force and getting to have a dash or attack? Right? There's just so much. What am I going to do with Mama T? Dashing and performing an attack. There's just so much that can happen, and you should be thinking really hard about that if you're going to be making it. Like I said, Scott just he just doesn't go into primaries and secondaries. He is looking to wound supports because he has learned the painful lessons that come from attacking into these units that are meant to kind of absorb the blow. So don't, unless obviously, you got to wound, but if you're going to wound, again, think about what is the worst thing that can happen. Or, like Sam said, climb up that tree, leave him at 1 health, and then put Jango there, right? Put Jango there and deny them activations. That is, if you're playing into a control list, if you're an aggro list, you should not think, well, I'm just going to win with more aggro. That's what they want you to do. Play more of the control game. Play more of that slow game. Although, if you're running Vader Grievous, ignore everything we've said and just lose the game. You're a bad person. I'm just kidding. Everyone it's a super fun list, and people should run what they love. So
it is a really fun list to pilot. It kind of lives the dream of the big bad evil Star Wars guys running down the hallways or battlefields and just slicing up everything. Like, if you love the Vader hallway scenes, if you love the Chavatsky Clone Wars Grievous, where he just like murders 6 Jedi and like their entire army of clones in a 20-minute episode, this is the list for you.
This is the list for you. Yeah, it also it does feel really good to, if you've been playing Republic, just go run Vader Grievous just so you can see what it's like to roll more dice and deal damage, right? Like, it's just kind of a fun thing to experience, if you're playing the game. You can feel really bad for your opponent, but also, again, your opponent, it's good to get reps against this, to know what you're playing against. So, Sam, do you have any more thoughts on this? I feel like it hasn't been too deep of a dive, but I feel like we've hit all the major points. Is there anything else you want to add here?
No, I would just love to hear the community's thoughts and feedback on these kind of matchup breakdown episodes. Like, is this something that you guys want to hear more of, where we break down specific matchups between what we think are powerful lists and how to tech for them and against them? Love to hear people's thoughts on this matchup. Think if we got it wrong. So I would just love to hear what the community thinks.
Yeah, agreed. Also, there's one more thing I want to say, is that I run Ahsoka Dooku with Clan Kreese, because it's a premier format, and that's why I don't run B2s, although I think I will never admit to having said this outside of here. I think B2s are a better unit than Clan Kreese for several reasons, but I will say that B2s in my premier list are typically running with Grievous or something else, which is why I don't have them. But if you're running just like a standard format, not premier, B2s with Dooku are probably better in terms of getting that another ability way to trigger off of his identity. So that's just something to think about.
Yep, for sure.
All right, everyone. Well, we love you all. We hope you have an awesome week. Reminder, if you're in Utah, about that tournament that's happening on November 11th, Justin has a Longshanks link for it. We love you all. Join the Slack. Oh, one more thing is that I have sent out the first tranche of promos to people for the OB2 Dooku card. If you have not got one, it's because you're in the second tranche, and I will be sending those out to you. So fill out the Google form if you want a promo. The second thing is just remember everybody to log your games on the Google form, and that's it. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.